Gideon Rusk slammed his fist on the poker table so hard the whiskey glasses jumped. "She works for me," he snarled, loud enough for every man in the Red Lantern saloon to hear. "And if I say she's in the pot, she's in the pot." The folded contract hit the felt like a verdict. 28-year-old Mara Ellison was standing near the bar, still holding a serving tray, when she understood what the paper meant. Not furniture, not a horse, not a debt marker. Her. Her name, written in Gideon's handwriting, beside poker chips. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something happens that everyone will remember but nobody wants to admit they witnessed. If you had been standing in Mara's boots that night, what would you have done? If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow Mara's story all the way to the end, because what this woman did next will shake you to your core. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that saloon. The Red Lantern saloon smelled like sawdust, spilled beer, and men who hadn't bathed since the last thaw. On most nights, Mara Ellison moved through that smell without thinking about it. She'd learned to stop noticing things she couldn't change. She had been working for Gideon Rusk for 11 months. 11 months of hauling, washing, cooking, serving. 11 months of waking before anyone else and going to sleep after everyone else. 11 months of being promised wages that never arrived. Always an excuse. Always next week. Always something about a bad harvest or a supplier who hadn't paid or a delay at the freight office that Mara couldn't verify. And Gideon knew she couldn't verify. She was 28 years old and she had nothing. That wasn't entirely accurate. She had a worn-out dress she'd patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible. She had a pair of boots with a crack along the left sole that let in water when it rained. She had the knowledge her grandmother had given her. Plants, roots, remedies, the kind of practical wisdom that doesn't cost anything to carry but weighs more than gold when you need it. And she had a stubbornness that certain people in Cinder Ridge called pride, and that Mara called survival, because she had learned early that those two things look exactly the same from the outside. What Mara did not have was a contract she could enforce, a family to turn to, or enough money to leave. Gideon Rusk knew all three of those things. He had made it his business to know them. Gideon was the kind of man who studied weakness the way other men studied maps, carefully, methodically, always looking for the place where the road ran out. He was 41 years old, broad in the shoulders, with a thick gray-streaked beard and small, intelligent eyes that never quite matched his smile. He ran the supply operation attached to the saloon, which meant he controlled the flow of goods into Cinder Ridge, which meant that nearly everyone in town owed him something. Not legally, not in writing, but in the way that people owe favors to someone who has decided to make himself necessary. He had hired Mara when she'd been desperate enough to accept his terms without reading them carefully. She'd been too hungry to ask better questions. He had never let her forget that. The poker game had started early that Thursday evening with 6 men around the table. By the time the crowd thinned to 3, Gideon was losing. Not catastrophically. Gideon rarely lost catastrophically, because he had a habit of leaving games before they turned against him. But tonight something was different. Tonight Gideon had been drinking more than usual, and the man across the table from him, a quiet cattle rancher from the Blackstone Basin named Thane Mercer, had been winning steadily without appearing to try very hard, which Gideon found more infuriating than losing itself. Thane Mercer didn't talk much. That was the first thing people noticed about him, and for a lot of people in Cinder Ridge it was also the last thing they noticed, because a quiet man didn't give you much to hold on to. He was 36, lean in the way men get lean when they've spent years doing physical work without enough food, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that looked like they'd been used hard since childhood. He'd inherited the Mercer Ranch from his father 7 years ago and had spent those 7 years mostly trying to keep it from falling apart, a project that had consumed him so completely that he had very little left over for socializing, which suited him fine and made him something of a mystery to everyone in town, which suited him fine too. He was not a gambler by nature. He'd come into the Red Lantern that evening because Orson Pike, his foreman, had asked him to pick up a supply order, and Orson's contact wasn't available until late, and Thane had needed somewhere to sit. He hadn't intended to win Gideon Rusk's money. He was in the process of doing it anyway. The third player, a freight agent named Hollis, had already folded and was nursing his drink at the bar, watching with the relaxed attention of a man who has lost his stake and no longer has anything at risk. He was the one who saw Gideon's hand go to his coat pocket. He was the one who watched Gideon pull out the folded paper. And he was the one who would later tell people that the look on Gideon's face in that moment wasn't desperation. It was calculation. "I'll raise," Gideon said. He set the paper on the table. Thane looked at it without picking it up. "What is that?" It wasn't quite a question. Thane had a way of saying things that left room for the other person to fill in, which sometimes meant the other person said more than they intended. "Employment contract," Gideon said. He leaned back in his chair with the practiced ease of a man performing confidence. "My girl over there? Mara. She owes me for room and board, tools, supplies. The contract covers the debt. I put it in the pot. It's worth at least what I'm short." The saloon had been loud a moment before. It went quiet in the particular way that large rooms go quiet when everyone realizes simultaneously that something is happening that they should be paying attention to. Mara had been moving toward the back table with 2 empty glasses to collect. She stopped walking. She looked at the paper on the table. She looked at Gideon's face, and she felt something inside her go very, very cold. She had known Gideon was ruthless. She had not known, until that moment, exactly how far ruthless could go. There is a difference between knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your chest like a stone dropped into still water. Across the room, she heard Hollis say something low and uncomfortable. A few other men shifted in their seats. Someone near the door muttered something that got swallowed by the noise of the street outside. Nobody stopped it. That was the part that Mara would carry with her longest. Not Gideon's action, because Gideon had been showing her who he was for 11 months, and she had been choosing not to fully believe it. No. What she would carry longest was the room's silence. 20-some-odd people who saw what was happening and chose the comfortable option of not becoming involved. She set the glasses down on the nearest surface she could find. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs so nobody could see. Thane Mercer had still not touched the contract. "That's a person," Thane said. "That's a debt instrument," Gideon said. "Same as any other collateral. She's under contract to me, and the contract transfers." "Does she know that?" "She doesn't need to know. She works for me." Thane looked at Gideon for a long moment. Then he looked across the room. He found Mara's face without appearing to search for it, which might have been because she was the only person in the saloon standing perfectly still while everyone else was either looking away or murmuring to their neighbors. For a second, just a second, their eyes met. Mara didn't know what she expected to see in a stranger's face in that moment. Pity, maybe. Discomfort. The mild, guilty look of a man who recognizes a wrong but doesn't plan to do anything about it. She didn't see any of those things. What she saw, or what she thought she saw, though she would question herself about it for weeks afterward, was something more like anger, quiet anger, the kind that doesn't shout. Thane looked back at Gideon. "I'll play the hand," he said. Gideon smiled. He shouldn't have smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he had already won, and that kind of certainty has a way of making a person careless. He played the next hand with the looseness of someone who expects the outcome to go in their favor, and it didn't. And when Thane laid his cards on the table, the silence in the room changed quality. It became the silence of held breath. Gideon stared at the cards for a long time. He stared at the contract sitting in the pot. He picked up his drink and finished it. Then Thane Mercer reached for the contract, and every person in the Red Lantern Saloon braced themselves for whatever came next. What came next was this. Thane read the contract. Not quickly, carefully, the way you read something when you want to understand it rather than just process it. The room waited. Gideon waited. Mara, who had moved closer without realizing she was moving, waited. Then Thane tore the contract in half. Not dramatically, not with any visible emotion. He just gripped both sides and pulled, and the paper gave way with a dry, tearing sound that was somehow louder than anything else that had happened that evening. "No card game decides another person's life," he said. He set the 2 halves on the table. "I won the hand. The paper was in the pot. What I do with what I win is my business." Gideon's face did something complicated. The ease drained out of it, replaced by something harder underneath. Something that had been there all along, Mara realized, just better covered. "That contract is legally—" "I just destroyed it," Thane said. He said it the same way he might say that rain was wet, like a statement of observable fact. It doesn't exist anymore. He stood up. He was taller than Gideon, though not by much, and the height didn't seem to matter as much as the stillness. Gideon was a man who filled space with his presence. Thane Mercer seemed to take up exactly as much space as he occupied and no more, which paradoxically made him harder to dismiss. He picked up the money he'd won, all of it except what he'd started with, which he left on the table in front of Gideon's empty seat, and walked toward the bar. He stopped a few feet from Mara. He didn't look at her the way men in that saloon usually looked at her. He didn't look at her like a problem or a curiosity or something that belonged to someone else. He looked at her the way you look at a person. "I don't know your situation," he said, quietly enough that it was mostly just the two of them hearing it. "I'm not going to pretend I do, but you've got options he doesn't want you to know you have." He paused. "I've got a working ranch about 4 miles out in the basin. There's a cabin that's been empty since last spring. No strings on it. You can leave tomorrow, stay in town, or take the cabin until you figure out what you want to do. Your choice." Mara looked at him. She had spent 11 months working for a man who treated her choices as obstacles to be managed. She had spent most of her adult life in situations where choices were things other people made about her. She didn't trust easily. She had stopped trusting easily sometime around age 15, and the years since had given her no compelling reason to start again. "Why?" she said. It wasn't the most sophisticated question she'd ever asked, but it was the honest one. Thane seemed to consider this. He wasn't the kind of man who reached for easy answers, which was either a virtue or an inconvenience depending on the situation. "Because tearing that paper doesn't fix what he was trying to do," he said, "and leaving you here with him doesn't fix it either." That was all he said. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a rescue. He wasn't offering her salvation or a new life or anything so large and untestable as that. He was offering her a cabin and time, which was, Mara understood, actually quite a lot. She looked across the room at Gideon, who was watching the conversation with his hands wrapped around a new glass, and his expression doing something she recognized, that particular combination of anger and careful patience that meant he was not done, that he was adding this moment to a mental ledger he intended to settle later. She looked back at Thane. "I'll take the cabin," she said. She didn't say thank you. She wasn't sure thank you was what this moment called for. She said it like what it was, a decision, one that belonged to her. Gideon watched her walk toward the saloon door with the controlled, deliberate steps of someone who has decided not to run, even though part of them wants to. He watched her pull the door open and step out into the cold, cinder-ridged night. He watched Thane Mercer follow, unhurried. And Gideon Rusk sat alone at the poker table with his torn contract and his almost empty glass, and the particular fury of a man who has just discovered that someone else is willing to do what he didn't expect. He had lost the game. He had not accepted losing her. The fire in the lanterns overhead threw shadows across his face, and in those shadows, if you'd been watching closely enough, and Hollis was watching, because Hollis had been watching people for 40 years, you could see something happen behind Gideon's eyes. Not grief, not shame. Just the slow, deliberate closing of a door that had been briefly open, and the quiet, cold beginning of a plan. Outside, the night air hit Mara like a hand pressed flat against her chest. She stopped on the wooden sidewalk and breathed it in. She could hear the saloon noise behind her, muffled now, and the sound of Thane's boots on the boards a few feet back, and further away the ordinary nighttime sounds of Cinder Ridge, going about its business without any awareness that something had just shifted. Her hands were still shaking. She curled her fingers into fists inside the pockets of her coat, a coat she'd also patched more times than she could count, and she breathed out slowly through her nose. 4 miles to the Mercer Ranch, a cabin that had been empty since last spring. She didn't know this man. She didn't know what the ranch looked like, or who else worked there, or whether the cabin had a working stove or a decent roof. She didn't know if she was trading one bad situation for a different one, but she had made the decision with her eyes open, which was more than she could say for the decision that had brought her to Gideon's employment in the first place. And she had made it herself, which meant whatever came next, whatever went wrong or sideways or harder than she expected, it would be hers to navigate. That was not nothing. Behind her, the red lantern's door opened and closed again, and she heard Hollis's voice say something to someone on the steps, and then quieter voices. And then the specific quality of a crowd dispersing because the evening's main event was over. Mara started walking toward the livery stable, where she'd left the few things she owned. She didn't look back at the saloon. She almost did. She decided against it. Some things you look at once and carry with you forever. The rest you leave where they fell. The road to Mercer Ranch was not a road so much as a suggestion. Two ruts worn into the earth by years of wagon wheels, cutting through scrub grass and frozen mud, disappearing entirely in places where the wind had pushed dead brush across the path. Mara followed Thane's horse on foot because she didn't have a horse, and he rode slowly enough that she didn't have to struggle to keep up, which she appreciated without saying so. He didn't fill the silence with conversation. She didn't either. She had learned over the years that silence between two people could mean many different things. Sometimes it meant hostility. Sometimes it meant indifference. Sometimes, rarely, it meant that both people were too tired for pretending and had reached some wordless agreement to simply let the night be what it was. She decided provisionally that this was the third kind. The basin opened up around her as they descended from the ridge, wider than she'd expected, darker than town, with a cold that was different from Cinder Ridge cold, less about wind and more about depth, the kind of cold that had been settling into the earth for months and wasn't in any hurry to leave. Stars overhead in a quantity that always startled her when she was away from lantern light. She had grown up in a place like this, before circumstances had moved her to smaller and smaller spaces, and the sky's scale felt both familiar and accusing. The ranch appeared gradually, rather than all at once. First the fence line, then the shapes of outbuildings against the dark, then the main house. Not large, not the kind of place that announced itself, but solid in a way that communicated years of maintenance rather than original quality. Someone had taken care of this place. Someone had also been losing the battle against various forms of deterioration, because as they got closer she could see the missing shingles on the barn roof, the fence section propped up with a stone rather than properly repaired, the gate that hung slightly crooked on its post. Not neglect exactly. More like a man stretched too thin, doing what he could and acknowledging privately that some things would have to wait. She recognized that particular condition. Thane dismounted at the barn without ceremony, and a boy of about 16 materialized from somewhere inside to take the horse, moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He glanced at Mara with open curiosity and then looked at Thane, the way young people look at their employers when they want to ask something but haven't decided if it's their place. "This is Eli," Thane said. "He works the ranch." "Evening," Eli said to Mara. He had the kind of face that hadn't settled into itself yet. Still young enough that every expression moved across it freely, without the controlled economy that adults develop when they've learned that showing too much costs something. "Evening," Mara said. That was apparently enough social interaction for Thane, who had already turned toward the main house and was pulling off his gloves as he walked. Mara followed at a slight distance, not because she was uncertain, but because she was cataloging, noting the water trough that had a crack along the side. Someone had tried to patch with river clay, the stack of firewood that looked adequate for maybe 3 more weeks, if the winter stayed mild and completely insufficient. If it didn't, the smell coming from somewhere near the east wall of the barn that suggested an animal with a digestive problem, or possibly an infection. The cabin was behind the main house and slightly to the left, connected to the yard by a path that someone had once lined with flat stones, most of which were still reasonably flat. Thane unlatched the door and pushed it open. Cold air poured out, the particular cold of a space that hadn't been heated in months. He went in before her and coaxed a lantern to life, and she stood in the doorway and looked at what she had agreed to. It was one room, a stove, a bed frame with a mattress that had seen better years, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf with nothing on it. The floor was swept. Someone, maybe Thane, maybe a previous resident, had left a folded blanket on the mattress. The window had glass, which was better than she'd been half expecting. "Stove works," Thane said. "There's wood stacked outside the east wall. I'll have Eli bring more in the morning. I can get my own wood." He looked at her. "I know," he said, without any particular emphasis, and then he set the lantern on the table and left her to it. She stood in the middle of the cabin for a while after his footsteps crossed back to the main house. She stood there long enough for the cold to work through her coat in earnest. Then she found the wood outside the east wall, which wasn't quite where he'd described, but was close enough, and she brought in several armloads and got the stove going with more trouble than she would have liked. The flue had a sticky catch that required a specific kind of pressure she had to figure out through trial and error while kneeling on a cold floor in the dark. When the fire finally caught and began to establish itself, she sat back on her heels and looked at the small orange glow behind the stove's iron door and allowed herself approximately 30 seconds of something that might have been relief. Then she started assessing the actual situation she was in. She had no wages. She had no contract she could enforce. She had her grandmother's knowledge and her own 2 hands and the experience of 11 months of surviving Gideon Rusk, which had been unpleasant, but had also been educational in ways Gideon hadn't intended. She was living in a stranger's cabin on a stranger's ranch with no formal arrangement and no guarantee of anything. The question was what to do with that. She didn't sleep well. The mattress had a spring that found her shoulder blade regardless of how she positioned herself, and the stove required feeding twice in the night to stay useful, and her mind kept returning to Gideon's face when he'd watched her walk out the saloon door, that careful, calculating stillness that she'd learned over 11 months to distrust far more than his anger. In the morning, she was up before dawn, which was when she found the first real problem. She had gone to the main house to find where the water supply was, intending to be discreet about it, and instead she'd found Orson Pike sitting at the kitchen table with his left boot off and his face the color of old paste, trying to wrap something around his lower leg with hands that weren't quite steady enough for the job. He was 60 or so, built like someone who had been larger and had gradually lost the argument with age, with white hair and a thick mustache, and the kind of deeply creased face that meant either a life spent outdoors or a life spent worrying, or most likely both. He'd clearly heard her come in but hadn't looked up, which meant he was either in more pain than he wanted to show, or he was stubborn enough to pretend he hadn't been caught, or both of those things simultaneously. "Good morning," Mara said carefully. "Umph," said Orson. She came closer, not quickly, the way you approach an animal that might startle. She could see his leg now. The ankle was swollen to an unkind size, the skin around it mottled in a way that suggested this was not a new injury being treated, but an old one being badly managed. "How long has it been like that?" she said. "None of your business," Orson said, with the automatic sharpness of a man who has spent considerable effort keeping this particular problem invisible. Then, apparently recognizing that the leg was currently visible to a stranger in his employer's kitchen, he modified slightly. "Few weeks." "Few weeks," she repeated. "I said it's none of your... You've been working on it. Ranch doesn't run itself." She pulled the second kitchen chair out and sat down across from him without being invited, which he clearly found presumptuous but was in too much discomfort to protest effectively. She looked at the wrap he'd been attempting. It was the wrong kind of compression for what she was looking at. Too tight in one place, too loose in another, cutting off circulation where it should have been supporting the joint. "My grandmother was a healer," Mara said, "not a doctor. She didn't have a degree or a practice or anything formal, but she knew what to do with things like this." She paused. "You can tell me to leave, but you should let someone look at it properly before you lose the use of it permanently." Orson stared at her for a long moment. She could see him running the calculation, pride against practicality, privacy against the growing reality that his leg was not improving on its own. "What's your name?" he said finally. "Mara Ellison." "Orson Pike." He said it like they were meeting at a social occasion and not in a kitchen at dawn with his bare foot on a chair. "Thane told me he brought someone back, didn't say much else." "He doesn't seem to say much in general." Something moved in Orson's expression that might have been amusement. "No," he agreed. "He doesn't." She unwrapped the bandage he'd been fighting with. He hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. She examined the joint carefully, pressing at specific points, watching his face to gauge where the pain registered, asking him to move it in certain directions and not others. It wasn't broken, or if it had been broken at some earlier point, it had set itself in a fashion that was livable. What it was inflamed in the specific way of an injury that had been aggravated repeatedly without adequate rest, and there were early signs of something worse developing in the tissue if it continued to be ignored. "I need yarrow if you have it, or willow bark, or both," she said, "and clean cloth, and something to use as a proper brace." "Medicine cabinet's in the back room," Orson said. He had the tone of a man who has decided to stop arguing because arguing takes energy he currently needs for other things. "Don't know what's in it." What was in it was not yarrow or willow bark. What was in it was a bottle of something strong enough to use as a disinfectant, some bandaging cloth of variable quality, a rusted tin with 2 dried herbs inside that Mara sniffed carefully before determining were not what she needed but would do for the moment, and a wooden splint that was too long but could be cut down. She worked on Orson's ankle for 40 minutes, during which time Thane came downstairs, stopped in the kitchen doorway, took in the scene, and chose not to interrupt. When Mara finally looked up, he was leaning against the doorframe with a cup of something hot, watching. "I need to go into the valley," she said. "There's a spot near the creek bend about 2 miles east where yarrow grows. Or used to, last time I came through this area." "East Creek Bend," Thane said. "Still grows there. I can take you. I know what yarrow looks like. The path floods in one spot. You'd go ankle deep without knowing where to step around it." She considered this. "Fine," she said. Orson, who was looking at his newly wrapped ankle with the expression of a man who has felt something improve and is not quite ready to admit it, said, "She know what she's doing, Thane?" Thane looked at Mara. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "Ask me in a week." It was the most reasonable answer anyone had given her in 11 months. She almost smiled. She caught it before it happened, but it was close. The days that followed had their own particular rhythm, nothing like what she'd expected, and nothing she could have described accurately to someone who hadn't lived it. Mercer Ranch in late autumn was a place under constant quiet pressure, the kind of pressure that didn't announce itself dramatically, but was present in every decision, every morning calculation about what needed to happen before dark, every glance at the sky to read what the weather was planning. Thane was not an easy man to know. He wasn't unfriendly. He was simply contained in a way that left very little visible on the surface, which could read as coldness unless you watched long enough to see the smaller things. The way he made sure Eli ate before he did when the evening meal ran short. The way he repaired the fence section himself on a Sunday morning without mentioning it to anyone. The way he checked the cabin stove the first 3 mornings, early enough that Mara didn't see him do it, but she saw the footprints in the frost leading away from her door. She didn't say anything about that either. What she saw in the ranch's condition concerned her more than she showed. The food stores were genuinely thin, not crisis thin yet, but thin in the way that meant a hard winter would tip them past the comfortable margin. The root cellar had gaps where there should have been bulk. The preserved vegetables were insufficient for the number of mouths the ranch fed, including Eli, Orson, a part-time hand named Cecil, who came 3 days a week, and now Mara herself. Livestock were weakening in ways that had multiple causes, some dietary, some illness-adjacent, some just the accumulated cost of a hard previous season. And the garden. The garden was what bothered her most, because the garden represented the most repairable of the problems and also the most neglected. It had been a real kitchen garden once. The bed layout was still visible, the soil had been properly turned at some point, but it had been left fallow the previous season and then left again, and now it was full of dead grass and compacted earth and the skeletal remains of plants that had never been harvested. She asked Thane about it on the 4th evening, when they were both in the yard at the same time for reasons that had nothing to do with each other. "Last spring," he said. He was fixing a bridle with the focused attention of someone doing something familiar. "Orson's leg went bad right at planting time. I was moving cattle. We didn't get to it." "What about this spring?" He looked at her. "What about it?" "If I planned the beds now," she said, "worked the soil before the ground froze completely, I could set it up so that someone, Eli, if Orson's leg is still bad, or Orson if it improves, could plant it properly in March. You'd have vegetables by summer." Thane set the bridle down. He looked at the garden, then at her, with an expression she still couldn't quite read after 4 days of watching him. "What do you get out of it?" he said. She had been waiting for this question. She respected him a little more for asking it directly, rather than pretending the situation didn't have any edges. "Somewhere to be while I figure out what I'm doing next," she said, "and I don't know how to sit still, so." "So," he repeated, and something in his voice suggested he understood this very well, and found it neither admirable nor pathetic but simply true. "I'm not asking you for anything," she added. "The cabin in the woods already more than—" "Stop," he said. Not unkindly, just cleanly. "You don't have to do that." "Do what?" "Make yourself small so I don't feel like I've done you a favor that you owe something back on." He picked up the bridle again. "I offered the cabin. You took it. That's done. What you do after that is your own business." She thought about that for a while. "I'll start on the garden tomorrow," she said. He nodded once and went back to the bridle. What she actually started on was the kitchen, because the kitchen was the most immediate problem, and also because she couldn't help it. She walked in the next morning to start water for the yarrow treatment she'd been preparing for Orson, and she found the state of the preserved food stores in a configuration that was going to waste 20% of what they had through poor storage, and she couldn't look at it and walk away. She reorganized it methodically, moving things that needed cold to the positions where the cellar stayed coldest, separating things that were giving off ethylene from things that would be damaged by it, checking seal quality on the jars, and setting aside 3 that were compromised. Orson found her at it and stood in the cellar doorway watching. "Nobody asked you to do that," he said. "I know." A pause. "You're right about those 3 jars, though. I kept meaning to check them." "The rest of it'll keep now," she said. "You'll lose less." Orson was quiet for a moment. "Thane said you worked for Gideon Rusk before this." She kept her hands moving. 11 months. "What happened?" "He gambled me in a poker game." She said it straightforwardly, because she had decided on her second night in the cabin that she was not going to be ashamed of what had been done to her. "Your employer won, tore the contract up." Orson made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "I knew Gideon when he first came to the valley," he said, "before he got the supply operation going. He was always the kind of man who thought the world owed him what he hadn't earned." He paused. "I should have known he'd find a way to get uglier." "Most people do," Mara said. "Get uglier, given time." "Most people," Orson allowed. "Not all." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was leaning more weight on his good leg than usual, which meant he'd been overusing the bad one earlier and was paying for it now. "You need to stay off it today," she said. "Ranch. Eli can do it. And Thane's here today. Let the leg rest, or by February you won't be able to use it at all. And then who runs this place?" Orson's expression went through several stages of resistance and landed somewhere in the vicinity of reluctant compliance. "You're a bossy woman," he said. "I've been called worse." He almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. Over the following week, she worked the garden in the afternoons, after the morning treatments for Orson and the kitchen work and whatever else presented itself. The ground was harder than she'd hoped and easier than she'd feared, and Eli, who had a teenager's combination of genuine helpfulness and genuine desire to be doing something less tedious, turned up the second afternoon and started working the bed at the far end without being asked. She showed him the layout she was planning. He crouched over it with the focused attention of someone who was actually interested rather than just being polite, asking questions that were occasionally obvious and occasionally surprisingly precise. What grows next to what? Why some plants help each other? How you know what the soil needs? She answered them straight, without simplifying, and he absorbed them with the specific hunger of a young person who is learning something that feels immediately useful. "Orson says you know medicine," Eli said one afternoon. "I know plants," Mara said. "It's not the same thing as medicine." "Is there a difference?" She thought about this. "A doctor knows how to fix things that are broken. I know how to keep things from breaking, mostly. And some of the same plants do some of the same things, but I wouldn't try to do a doctor's job, and I'd hope a doctor wouldn't try to do mine." Eli turned this over. "What if there's no doctor?" "Then you do what you can and you're honest about the limits." He nodded, slowly, like he was filing this away somewhere permanent. The afternoon she noticed the livestock problem was the afternoon everything got more complicated. She'd gone to the barn to ask Eli something and found instead 3 of the cattle in the east pen showing the same symptoms, a specific kind of lethargy that combined with the way they were standing to tell her something was wrong with their feed, not their health, which was a meaningful distinction. She looked at what they were being given and found the problem in the hay batch, a section that had gone bad in a particular way, not visibly obvious, but carrying something that was accumulating in the animals. She separated the bad batch herself because Eli wasn't there, and the issue was immediate. She was in the middle of doing this, which was hot and unpleasant work even in cold weather, when she heard voices outside the barn. Not Thane's voice, not Orson's. She stopped moving. "Heard she's been staying out here." This voice was female, confident, the kind of voice that was used to being listened to. "It's been more than a week, Lawrence." "Lenora," a man's voice, warning. "I'm just saying what people are saying." The woman's voice again. "Lenora, apparently, whoever that was. Thane wins her in a card game and brings her home. Gideon's been telling anyone who'll listen that she's been working a scheme on him for months. Gideon Rusk lost a poker hand and threw a tantrum, the man said tiredly. I was there. Were you? And what about the contract? What about... Thane tore the contract up. Whatever legal nonsense Gideon was claiming, the point, Lenora said, with the precision of someone who believes she has been making a point that lesser minds keep missing, is that nobody knows anything about this woman. She shows up with nothing. She attaches herself to a man who lives alone, and within a week she's taken over the household. Mara stood in the barn holding an armful of bad hay, listening to her reputation being assembled from nothing by a woman who had never spoken to her and felt a particular variety of anger that she'd felt before. The specific anger of being defined by strangers, of having your choices interpreted through a lens you had no hand in grinding. She also recognized something cold and practical underneath the anger. This would get worse before it got better. Gideon would make sure of it. She set the hay down carefully. She walked to the barn door and opened it. The woman outside, Lenora Vane, she would learn, the most influential merchant in Cinder Ridge after Gideon's fall, was striking in the way that certain women are striking, the kind of striking that comes from never having been uncertain about their own importance. She was perhaps 50, well-dressed for the frontier, with sharp eyes and a composed mouth, and the look of someone who had just been caught saying something she would now need to reframe. The man beside her, Lawrence, was softer in every way. A round-faced man with apologetic eyes who was clearly having a worse morning than he'd expected when he agreed to accompany his wife. Mara looked at Lenora. Lenora looked at Mara. You must be the woman people are talking about, Lenora said. She had a gift for turning observations into small weapons. I don't know what people are saying, Mara said, but I imagine Gideon Rusk has been helpful in shaping it. She kept her voice even. Not cold, not aggressive, just level. The way you keep a door level on its hinges when everything around it is slightly off kilter. Lenora's expression did something subtle, a recalibration, almost invisible. I came to speak with Thane, she said. He's at the south fence, Mara said. Eli can take you. That was all. She didn't justify herself, didn't explain, didn't volunteer anything Lenora hadn't asked for. She held the door open briefly and then went back to the hay problem because the cattle needed attending to now, and Lenora Vane's opinion of her would develop however it was going to develop, regardless of what Mara said in the next 5 minutes. But her hands, when she got back to the hay, were shaking again. Not with fear, with the effort of holding everything she wanted to say tightly enough that none of it had gotten out. She thought about Gideon's face in the saloon, the careful calculation in it. He hadn't needed to follow her to the ranch to cause damage. He was causing it from town, from whatever table he was sitting at, whatever ear he was bending, whatever version of events he was distributing to the people of Cinder Ridge who were curious about the woman Thane Mercer had brought home from a poker game. The story Gideon was telling, she understood, was designed to make Thane look foolish and her look predatory. It was elegant, in the way that certain cruelties are elegant, requiring no proof, appealing to existing suspicions, self-reinforcing because anyone who defended her could be absorbed into the narrative as another person she'd manipulated. She finished with the hay. She checked the cattle. She went to find Eli and explain what had happened with the bad batch so it wouldn't happen again. And she thought, with the specific clarity that sometimes comes when you understand a problem precisely, she was going to have to deal with Gideon, not run from him, not wait for him to get tired of it, deal with him, on ground she chose, in terms she controlled, at a time that was hers to decide. She didn't know yet when that would be. She didn't know yet exactly how. But she knew herself well enough to know that she wouldn't be waiting forever. 11 months of watching Gideon Rusk work had taught her more about power than the people who gave it to him had ever intended. She knew how it worked now, and she had learned something else, something she hadn't known when she walked out of the Red Lantern saloon with her hands shaking and the cold night air pressing against her chest like a warning. She'd learned it in the root cellar, and in the garden beds, and in Orson's kitchen in the early morning light. You didn't fight someone like Gideon by becoming like him. You made yourself so necessary that the ground he wanted to pull from under you was the same ground everyone else needed to stand on. The trick was doing it before he got there first. Thane found her at the edge of the garden as the light was going down. She didn't hear him approach. He moved quietly for a man his size, and she was kneeling over the plot she'd been mapping out, her hands pressed flat against the cold earth, feeling for the frost line that would tell her how much more time she had to work the soil before the ground locked. "Lenora left," he said. "I know. I heard her wagon." He stood near her, not directly behind, off to the side in the way he had of being present without imposing. "She'll talk," he said. "She already is." "It's not your fault." Mara pressed her fingers deeper into the soil. "I know it's not my fault," she said. "That doesn't change what it does." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet she'd begun to recognize as him actually thinking, rather than the silence of having nothing to say. "I could go talk to her," he offered. "That'll make it worse, me being something you're protecting." She sat back on her heels. "I need to handle it myself, when the time is right." He seemed to consider arguing. He didn't. "All right," he said. She looked at the garden, at what she'd gotten done in a week's afternoons. The cleared beds, the turned soil, the careful planning laid into the earth like a letter written to spring. More than she'd expected, less than she needed. "The food stores will last the winter if nobody goes hungry," she said, "which means rationing more than you've been doing. Orson's leg will hold if he keeps off it when it flares. The cattle are fine now that the bad batch is gone." She paused. "The roof on the south end of the barn needs work before the first big snow, or you'll lose the shelter for the east herd." Thane looked at the barn. "I know. I can't do the roof myself." "I know that too." She looked at him. He was looking at the barn with the expression she was starting to recognize. Not defeat, not resignation, but the particular focus of someone who has too many problems and has gotten good at ranking them. "I'll get to it," he said quietly. She believed him. She believed him in the specific way that you believe someone, not because they've given you evidence of being reliable, but because you've watched them for long enough to see the shape of them. The places where they bend, the places where they don't. And Thane Mercer didn't seem to bend on the things that mattered, which was both reassuring and, she suspected, sometimes very hard on him. The cold was deepening. She could feel it in her knees from the ground, in her face from the air. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her palms. Neither of them went inside immediately. They stood at the edge of the cold garden while the sky above the Blackstone Basin turned the particular color it turned at the end of autumn days. Not beautiful, exactly, but specific, the way everything out here was specific. Real in a way that she had not felt the inside of the Red Lantern Saloon was real. Real in a way that made Gideon's schemes feel, just for this moment, like something happening somewhere else, to someone she used to be. It wouldn't last, she knew that, but she let herself have the moment anyway. The notice arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside an envelope that had been left at the Mercer Ranch gate sometime before dawn. Eli found it when he went out to check the water trough and brought it to the main house without opening it, which showed a restraint unusual for a 16-year-old boy, though Mara suspected he'd held it up to the light at least once. Thane read it at the kitchen table while Orson watched from his chair by the stove with the expression of a man who already suspects bad news and is simply waiting for confirmation. He set it down. "Silas Dorr," he said. The name came out flat, the way he said things he found distasteful. Orson sat forward. "Dorr's in the valley?" "According to this, he's been retained by Gideon to review a labor contract dispute." Thane slid the paper across the table. "He's requesting Mara present herself at the Cinder Ridge Meeting Hall in 4 days for a formal inquiry." Mara was at the stove. She had been listening since the moment Thane's voice changed. Not dramatically, just the subtle tightening that she'd learned was his version of alarm. And she turned now and looked at the paper without touching it. "Who is Silas Dorr?" she said. "Contract agent," Orson said, and the way he said it carried weight beyond the words. "Comes through the valley every few years when someone's got a legal dispute that needs official-looking paperwork and someone willing to enforce it. He's not a lawyer. He's not exactly not a lawyer either. He works the gray space between what's legal and what people can be persuaded to accept as legal. He works for whoever pays him," Thane said. "And Gideon pays well," Orson added. He rubbed his jaw. "Last time Dorr came through, he helped a landowner in the northern basin push 3 families off their property using a contract clause nobody had read carefully enough. Families were gone before anyone could organize to help them." Mara looked at the notice. The language was formal, almost impressively formal for a frontier document, and dense in the way of things written to obscure rather than clarify. The phrase that sat in the center of it like a stone was this: Pursuant to the terms of the original labor agreement, the holder of said contract retains the right to compel continued service pending formal review of any claimed breach. Gideon had found another contract, or manufactured one. She wasn't sure which was worse. He can't compel anything, she said. Thane tore the original up. He'll argue that the original was destroyed unlawfully, Thane said, that tearing it didn't void the underlying agreement, that the agreement still stands because the debt it represented, room, board, supplies, was never formally settled. The silence in the kitchen had a specific quality to it, the quality of people who understand a problem fully and don't yet know what to do about it. Eli was in the doorway. Nobody had told him to leave, and he'd clearly decided that absence would be a greater inconvenience than presence. "Can they actually make her go?" he asked. "They can make it very difficult if she doesn't," Thane said. Mara picked up the notice then. She read it twice. Not quickly. The way you read something when you want to understand every word rather than just the general shape of it, which was a habit her grandmother had insisted on when Mara was young enough to find it tedious. "Always know exactly what you're dealing with," her grandmother had said. "People lie in the spaces between what they say and what they actually mean, and the only way to find those spaces is to read slowly." She set the paper down. "I'll go," she said. 3 people looked at her. "Mara," Thane started. "If I don't go, I'm hiding," she said. "And hiding looks like guilt, and Gideon knows it looks like guilt, which is why the notice gives 4 days instead of 2. Enough time for me to run if I'm going to run, and enough time for everyone in Cinder Ridge to notice that I did." She folded the notice once, crisply, along its original crease. "He wants me to run. He's been trying to make me run since the night I walked out of the Red Lantern." Thane was watching her with that expression she still couldn't entirely read, the one that was more than neutral and less than everything else. "If you go," he said slowly, "you need to be ready to speak. Dor will be there to look official. Gideon will be there to look wronged. The room will be full of people who've been listening to Gideon's version of events for 2 weeks. I know. That's not easy. I know that too." He didn't push further. She had noticed this about him, that he stated the difficulty of a thing once, clearly, and then trusted the person he was speaking to have understood it. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't soften or harden. He just said what was true and then let you do what you were going to do. She respected that in a way that had been accumulating quietly for 2 weeks, building in the spaces where a lesser man would have felt the need to take up more room. The next 4 days were not calm, though she tried to treat them as such. Word spread, as word always spread in Cinder Ridge, through the particular network of small exchanges that connected the valley, a comment at the feed store, a conversation at the well, a remark passed between 2 women at the dry goods counter that was overheard by 3 other people who each told 2 more. By Wednesday, people knew that Gideon had brought in Silas Dor. By Thursday, people knew that Mara intended to show up at the hearing. By Friday morning, when she and Thane and Orson, who had insisted on coming and been argued with and won, made the 4-mile drive to Cinder Ridge in Thane's wagon, the meeting hall was already half full an hour before the appointed time. Mara sat on the wagon bench and watched the town come into view and felt the particular sensation she'd been carrying since Tuesday. Not quite fear, not quite resolve, something in the middle that was harder to name. Her hands were still in her lap. She was wearing the better of her 2 dresses, which wasn't saying much, but she'd pressed it the night before and mended the cuff that had been fraying, and she'd done her hair with the care of someone who understands that appearance is a form of argument. She was not going to walk into that room looking like someone who had given up. Orson noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly. He said, "Good morning for it," which didn't mean anything in particular except that he was there. The meeting hall in Cinder Ridge was a long, low-ceilinged room that served approximately 6 different civic functions, depending on the day of the week. On that Saturday, it had been arranged with the particular formality of something that was trying to look like court without being court. A table at the front where Silas Dor was already seated, a chair positioned alone in front of the table that was clearly meant for Mara, and rows of seating behind that were filling steadily with the men and women of the valley who had decided that whatever was about to happen was worth watching. Silas Dor was younger than she'd expected. Early 40s, perhaps, with a precise beard and the careful clothes of a man who wants to be taken seriously in places that might not take him seriously by default. He had a stack of papers in front of him, and an expression of professional neutrality that she recognized as the close cousin of condescension. Gideon was seated to Dor's right. He was wearing his good jacket. He trimmed his beard. He looked, to anyone who didn't know him, like a reasonable man who had been wronged and was patiently seeking correction. Mara knew what was underneath that performance. She had spent 11 months close enough to see the seams. She took the chair. She did not look at Gideon when she sat down, not because she was afraid to, but because she didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing she'd thought about him first. She looked at Dor. "Miss Ellison," Dor said, "thank you for attending." "I wasn't given much choice," she said, pleasantly. Not quite a challenge, but not quite not one. Something moved in Dor's professional neutrality. Just briefly. He opened the hearing with a prepared statement that was long and technical and clearly designed to make the proceeding sound more legally binding than it was. He cited the original labor agreement, which he had obtained from somewhere, possibly Gideon, possibly a copy Gideon had kept, and summarized its terms, including the clause regarding room and board and the provision for extended service in cases of unsettled debt. Mara listened to all of it without interrupting. She kept her hands folded in her lap, and her expression settled. She had decided, the night before, that she would not be the person in this room who showed the most emotion, because the person in a room who shows the most emotion is usually the person who loses control of the narrative. When Dor finished, he turned to Gideon, who told his version of events with the practiced fluency of a man who had been rehearsing it. In Gideon's telling, Mara had been a difficult employee who repeatedly refused to honor the terms of her agreement. The poker game was barely mentioned. It was described as an informal transfer of administrative documents that Thane Mercer had then destroyed without legal right. The contract, Gideon argued, still represented a legitimate debt, and Mara's departure from his employment without settlement constituted breach. He sounded reasonable. He had always been able to sound reasonable. It was one of the things Mara had spent 11 months learning about him. When Gideon finished, Dor turned to Mara. "Miss Ellison, you may respond." The room was not quiet. Rooms with 40 people in them are never entirely quiet. But it was as close to quiet as it was going to get. Mara looked at Dor first. Then she turned and looked at the room. She had not planned a speech. She had planned something different from a speech. A series of facts, stated plainly, in the order that would make them most difficult to dismiss. Her grandmother had taught her that too, though her grandmother had put it differently. Don't try to be convincing, just be accurate. Convincing people can smell the effort. Accurate people don't have to try. "I worked for Gideon Rusk for 11 months, she said. Her voice was steady. Not loud. The room was quiet enough that she didn't need loud. Every month I asked about wages. Every month there was a reason they hadn't arrived. A supplier problem, a freight delay, a bad season. I kept a record of those conversations in a journal I still have. 41 separate occasions over 11 months when I asked and was told to wait." She paused. "Let that number sit." 41 times, she said again. "Not because I'm litigious, because my grandmother told me to write things down, and she was right about most things." There was a shift in the room, small, but real. "The night in question," she continued, "Gideon Rusk placed a contract with my name on it into a poker pot. Not a debt marker, not a promissory note, a document claiming authority over my time and my presence. He bet it the way you'd bet a horse or a piece of land." She let that sit too. "I was standing 12 feet away when he did it." Someone in the back of the room made a sound. She didn't look toward it. Thane Mercer won the hand and tore the contract up. He told me I could leave, stay in town, or take a cabin on his ranch while I figured out my next step. Those were the 3 options he gave me. No conditions, no additional obligations, just, here are your choices, they belong to you. She paused. That was the first time in 11 months someone had given me a choice and then stepped back to let me make it. Gideon shifted in his chair. She heard it. She turned to face Dor directly. "The contract Mr. Rusk is now producing. I'd like to know when it was signed, not the date written on it, when it was actually executed, because I signed one document in Mr. Rusk's employ." 1. And the terms of that document did not include anything resembling compelled service, extended obligation, or provisions for debt against room and board, because there was no room and board arrangement. I supplied my own lodging out of the first month's wages that were never paid. The room had gone quieter in a way that felt different from before. Quieter in the way of people who are recalculating. Dorr looked down at his papers. He looked at the contract. He looked at it for slightly longer than was comfortable. The document is dated. What date? Mara said. Dorr read the date. I had already left Mr. Rusk's employment by that date, Mara said. By 9 days. The silence this time was of a different quality entirely. Gideon said sharply, The date is a clerical. Is it? Mara said. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since sitting down. She had been saving this. A clerical error on the document you've brought here to compel my return. That seems like an important clerical error to make. She looked at Dorr. Doesn't it? Dorr's professional neutrality was working harder than it had been. From the side of the room, and this was the moment Mara would remember most precisely, would replay in full detail for months afterward, Orson Pike's voice came clearly. I can speak to Miss Ellison's conduct while she's been at Mercer Ranch, if that's relevant. Dorr looked at Orson. And you are? Orson Pike. Foreman at Mercer Ranch. Been in this valley 31 years. He said it without standing up, which somehow made it more authoritative. She reorganized our winter stores, treated my leg, which I'd been hiding from the doctor because I couldn't afford the ride to the next town. Worked our kitchen garden back from nothing. He paused. I've known a fair number of grifters in 31 years, Mr. Dorr. They don't do that kind of work. Neither do desperate women running from a bad situation, Eli said, from somewhere near the back wall, and then looked immediately as though he hadn't entirely meant to say that out loud. Mara did not look at him. She was watching the room, watching the way the weight in it was shifting, the slight adjustments in posture, the people who had come in with their opinions formed and were now not quite sitting the same way they'd been sitting 10 minutes ago. Lenora Vane was in the third row. She had been watching Mara with an expression that Mara couldn't entirely decipher. Not quite the hostility of their first encounter, not yet anything warmer than that, but watching. Closely, carefully, the way a woman watches another woman when she is trying to determine something real about her. Gideon stood up. He didn't ask Dorr's permission. She was under contract, he said. His voice had lost its careful reasonableness. Whatever the date, the underlying, "Sit down, Gideon," the voice came from the left side of the room. A rancher named Harwell, broad, weathered, the kind of man who had been in the valley long enough that people listened when he chose to speak, which wasn't often. He was looking at Gideon with the mild, fixed expression of someone who has decided. "Let the woman finish," Harwell said. Gideon looked at Harwell. He looked around the room. He sat down. Mara took a breath. Just one. She kept her voice level. "I'm not here to argue about the contract," she said. "Mr. Dorr can decide what it's worth. But I want to say something to the people in this room, because the people in this room are the ones this actually affects." She looked at them. Not at any one person, at all of them. If Gideon's claim is accepted today, if the argument that an employer can place a worker's time and presence in a card game and have that arrangement legally enforced, then every person who has ever hired help in this valley needs to think about what that means. Not for me, for the next person, for the hired hand who has no family, for the widow who takes work where she can find it, for the young man who comes to the valley with nothing and accepts the first offer made to him because he's hungry. She paused. He did this because he thought nobody in this room would speak up for someone like me. And maybe he was right about how I walked in here. I don't have money. I don't have family connections in this valley. I have 41 months of unpaid wages I can document, an address I've patched more times than I can count. She let her eyes settle on Dorr. But I also have the right to stand here and say that what he did was wrong, and to say it in front of everyone who's been hearing his version of events since the night it happened. The room was very still. Then, from somewhere in the middle rows, a woman Mara had never seen before said, quietly but clearly, "She's right about the hand who's got nobody." And the woman beside her nodded. Dorr looked at his papers. He looked at the contract. He looked at Gideon. He looked like a man who had been hired for a purpose and was calculating whether that purpose was still achievable. Gideon's face had gone to a color that wasn't healthy. Mara sat back. She had said what she'd come to say. She had said it to the room, not to Dorr, because she understood, had understood since Tuesday morning, that Dorr was not the actual decision-maker here. The room was the decision-maker. It always had been. Gideon had known it, which was why he'd been working the room for 2 weeks. She had known it, which was why she'd come. The formal proceeding lasted another 40 minutes. Dorr asked several clarifying questions, most of which revealed more about the contract's weaknesses than he'd probably intended. 2 more ranchers spoke on Mara's behalf, briefly, without flourish, in the blunt language of men who had made up their minds and saw no reason to elaborate. Gideon's position eroded in the specific way of structures that look solid until one load-bearing element gives way, slowly at first, then completely. Lenora Vane did not speak. Mara noticed. She also noticed that Lenora had stopped looking at her the way she'd looked at her in those first weeks, the weighing, slightly suspicious look of someone trying to find the angle. She was now looking at Gideon with an expression that Mara found harder to read, but that held something in it like reevaluation. Dorr adjourned the inquiry without ruling. He said he needed time to review the documentation. But he didn't look at Gideon when he said it, and he gathered his papers with the briskness of someone who has decided they would prefer to be somewhere else. In the frontier legal calculus of Cinder Ridge, that meant something. Outside the meeting hall, the cold air hit Mara the same way it had hit her outside the Red Lantern Saloon 3 weeks ago, like a hand flat against her chest. She stood on the wooden sidewalk and breathed it in and listened to the voices behind her, the sounds of 40 people dispersing into the ordinary afternoon. Thane was beside her. He hadn't spoken during the hearing. She hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't offered. She wasn't sure, until this moment, whether that had been the right choice or not. "You didn't have to stay quiet," she said. "You had it," he said simply. She thought about that. "Did I?" she said. "The room changed when you talked about the hired hand with no family," he said. "I watched it happen. 3 people who came in on Gideon's side shifted in their seats. That's when you had it." She nodded slowly. She didn't feel the way she'd expected to feel. She'd expected relief, or satisfaction, or at least the temporary lightness of having done something difficult. What she felt instead was a kind of flat exhaustion, the kind that comes not from the thing itself, but from all the days leading up to it, all the preparation and the anxiety and the lying awake, doing inventory of everything that could go wrong. "Orson shouldn't have stood up," she said. "His leg—" "Orson does what Orson decides to do," Thane said. "You know that by now." She did know that. She'd spent 3 weeks learning the specific shape of Orson's stubbornness, which was different from Thane's and different from hers, and had its own particular logic that she'd come to respect even when it frustrated her. Eli appeared from around the side of the building, slightly breathless, with the expression of someone who has been doing something purposeful. "Harwell wants to talk to you," he told Mara. "He's by the feed store." Harwell turned out to want to talk about the Spring Fence Cooperative, a shared labor arrangement between 4 ranches to repair the eastern boundary line that had been deteriorating for 2 seasons. He explained this to Mara in a businesslike way that treated her input as relevant, which was either a statement about what he'd seen in the meeting hall or simply the manner of a practical man. She gave her opinion on the timing based on what she knew about the Mercer Ranch workload, and he listened, and they reached an agreement on participation, and the whole conversation lasted 8 minutes and felt, in its way, more significant than anything that had happened inside. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride in. The afternoon had the specific light of late autumn in the basin, low and pale, the kind of light that makes long shadows out of ordinary things and gives the landscape a temporary melancholy that wasn't there at noon. Orson fell asleep somewhere around the 2nd mile, which was probably the best thing for his leg and also for his pride, since it meant he wasn't awake to be reminded that he'd spent several hours sitting in a hard chair and would pay for it tomorrow. Eli sat in the wagon bed and looked at the sky and was quiet in the way that young people are quiet when they're processing something larger than they expected. Mara sat on the bench beside Thane and looked at the road ahead. After a while, she said, "He's not done." Thane's hands were steady on the reins. "No," he agreed. "Dorr will find a way to let him down easy, preserve the professional relationship. But the hearing was a loss for him, and Gideon doesn't absorb losses." She looked at the distance. "He'll try something else, something less formal." "Probably," Thane said. "I want to be ready for it." "What does ready look like?" She thought about this for a genuine moment. Not performing thought, actually thinking. "I don't know yet, but I know he's going to come at us sideways, Through something we're not watching. She paused. He's embarrassed now. Embarrassment makes people stupid, but it also makes them desperate, and desperate is more dangerous than calculated. Thane was quiet for a moment. I'll write to the Basin ranchers, he said. Let them know what happened today, not to alarm anyone, just so people have the full picture. Good, she said. They rode without talking for a while. The ranch came into view as the light continued its slow fall, the familiar shapes of the outbuildings emerging from the dusk. The barn with its patched roof that Thane had gotten to before the first hard frost, which still gave Mara a quiet satisfaction every time she looked at it. The main house with the window lit from inside where someone had gotten the lamps going early, the garden beds dark and sleeping, waiting. She had built something here, she realized, not hers. She was honest enough with herself to know the difference between what she'd contributed and what she'd borrowed. But she'd added her hands to it, her knowledge, her grandmother's accumulated wisdom applied to cold soil and sick animals, and a 60-year-old man's stubbornness about his own leg. She had made herself useful to a place that hadn't asked for her, and in doing so had made herself harder to dismiss. Gideon had called her worthless. He had said it in 100 different ways over 11 months, not always with words, sometimes with the pay that didn't come, the tasks assigned with contempt, the assumption that her gratitude for being employed at all should outweigh any expectation of decent treatment. He had made a mistake, she understood now. The mistake was believing his own assessment. Worthless things don't need to be controlled. He'd needed to control her. Which meant, whatever he told himself and told the valley, he'd known the whole time that she was something else. The wagon pulled into the yard and Orson woke with a start and immediately pretended he hadn't been asleep, which was such a perfectly Orson thing to do that Eli made a sound that was half laugh and then turned it into a cough. Mara climbed down from the wagon. She stood in the yard for a moment and looked at the ranch, all of it, the whole complicated, imperfect, barely holding together reality of it, and felt the flat exhaustion begin, slowly, to give way to something more like the ground. Solid, specific, hers to stand on. She went to check the cattle. Then she went to start dinner because the day had been long and everyone was going to be hungry, and some things were that simple. Behind her, she heard Thane unhitching the horse, and Eli taking the reins, and Orson's voice carrying across the yard with some observation about the state of the fence gate that nobody had asked for and everyone was going to have to respond to. She let the ordinary noise of it close around her. She had won today. She knew it might not hold. She knew Gideon was somewhere in Cinder Ridge, right now doing his own accounting of what had happened, running his own calculations about what came next. She was ready for it. Or she would be. She was working on it. Doar's ruling came 6 days after the hearing, delivered in writing to both parties in the careful language of a man trying to close a door without appearing to slam it. The claim was dismissed on grounds of documentary inconsistency. The phrase Doar used was insufficient evidence to compel compliance, which was legal language for what everyone in Cinder Ridge already understood had happened. Gideon had overplayed his hand in a room full of people who'd watched him do it. The letter arrived at the ranch the same morning the first real snow came. Not a dusting, a real snow, the kind the Basin got when winter stopped being polite about its intentions. Mara had felt it coming for 2 days in the way the cold changed character, shifting from the sharp, dry cold of early season to something heavier and more deliberate. She'd spent those 2 days quietly accelerating every preparation she could manage. An additional round of food store checks, more firewood moved under cover, the livestock pen reinforced on the north side where the wind came hardest. Thane read Doar's letter at breakfast and set it beside his coffee without expression. Orson said, "Good," with the finality of a man who considered the matter settled. Eli asked if this meant Gideon couldn't try anything else, and the answer he got, from Mara, not Thane, was honest. It means this particular thing didn't work. It doesn't mean he's done. Eli absorbed this with the look he'd developed over the past weeks for absorbing difficult truths, which was a slight narrowing of the eyes and a compression of the mouth, and then he went back to eating. I was learning, she thought, what most people took much longer to learn, that the resolution of one problem rarely meant the absence of the next one. That was not pessimism, that was just how things worked. The snow came down in earnest by mid-morning and didn't stop. By afternoon, the ranch road had disappeared. By evening, the Basin was a flat white silence broken only by the sound of wind working its way through the fence lines and the occasional shift of the barn roof under accumulated weight. Mara went out twice to check the cattle and came back both times with her coat plastered, her boots soaked through above the ankle, and a specific kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with persistence. The third time she went out, Thane was already in the pen when she got there. He didn't say anything about her coming. She didn't say anything about him already being there. They checked the animals in the particular companionship of two people doing the same job in the same space without needing to negotiate it. And the lack of discussion was not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing that needed to be said out loud. On the way back to the house, the wind picked up sharply enough that Mara had to lean into it, and Thane put a hand briefly on her arm. Not to steady her, exactly, or not only that. And she let him, and they made it back to the porch and stamped the snow off their boots in the yellow light coming from the kitchen window, and neither of them remarked on any of it. She thought about that later, when she was alone in the cabin with the stove going and the wind working at the corners of the roof. The quiet accumulation of it. The way things that are real tend to build up slowly, rather than arriving complete. Word from town came the following week with Cecil, the part-time hand, who made the ride out despite the snow because he lived halfway between the ranch and Cinder Ridge, and the trip had become routine enough for him that a foot of snow was an inconvenience rather than a deterrence. He arrived with supplies, with the week's news from the valley, and with the particular expression of a man who has information he isn't sure he should deliver. Thane noticed it before Mara did. "What?" he said, before Cecil had fully gotten through the kitchen door. Cecil stamped his boots and took off his hat and held it in both hands in the way of people who are buying themselves time. "Gideon's hired some men," he said. "3 of them. Came in on the freight road 2 days ago, put up at the boarding house. Not ranch hands." He paused. "At least not primarily." The kitchen was quiet. "Who says?" Thane asked. "Hollis. You know he hears everything that happens at the boarding house because his cousin runs it." Cecil looked at Mara. "He says Gideon met with them for 2 hours the first evening, behind closed doors. But the men came out looking like they'd been given a job, and the job wasn't freight." Mara was at the counter. She had been pressing the yarrow preparation she'd been working on for a neighbor woman who'd asked about a persistent cough, and her hands were still. She looked at the pale yellow liquid in the jar and thought about what she'd said to Thane on the wagon ride home from the hearing. He's going to come at us sideways. She hadn't expected it to be this direct. "Does Hollis know their names?" Thane said. The leader gave a name, Cutter. Whether that's real or not, Hollis doesn't know. Cecil turned his hat around in his hands. "I'm sorry to bring it. I thought you should know." "You were right to bring it," Mara said. She set the jar down. "Did Hollis say when they're planning to move?" "No, but they haven't left town yet, as of 2 days ago. And with the roads the way they are," he glanced at the window and the white beyond it, "they'd be waiting for a break in the weather, probably." "That gives us time," Thane said. He said it quietly, mostly to himself. Then louder. "Cecil, can you get back to town and ask Hollis to send word the moment those men leave the boarding house? Any direction." "I can," Cecil said. He sounded relieved to have a specific task. Useful people need useful things to do. The waiting is its own kind of suffering. After Cecil left, the 4 of them, Thane, Mara, Orson, and Eli, sat around the kitchen table with the kind of directness that the situation had earned. No softening of it, no pretending the problem was smaller than it was. 3 men, Orson said. He'd been through enough in 31 years that his voice carried no panic, only the flat assessment of someone doing arithmetic. Hired for what exactly? Intimidation or something worse? Gideon's been humiliated twice now, Mara said. First night at the saloon, then the hearing. He's not the kind of man who counts his losses and moves on. She looked at the table. She looked at the table. He wants to win. Not the original thing anymore. I don't think this is about the contract at this point. It's about being publicly beaten by someone he decided wasn't worth anything. That's a dangerous kind of grudge, Orson said. I know. So we leave, Eli said. He said it in the uncertain way of someone trying out an idea they're not sure about. Or, Mara leaves, goes somewhere he can't reach. Mara looked at him. She understood the impulse behind it. She even recognized it as the reasonable-seeming option that fear tends to produce. If I leave, she said, he's taught everyone in this valley that you can drive someone out if you push hard enough and mean enough. And the next person he decides to push, whoever that is, will have less protection than I have now because I have all of you, and they'll only have the memory of watching me go. Eli thought about this. She watched him think about it, the actual working through of it, which was what she'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't nod to seem agreeable. He chewed on things until they made sense. Okay, he said finally. So we stay. What does that look like? It looks like not being alone, Thane said. He had been quiet during most of this exchange, thinking in the way he thought, thoroughly, without rushing. The ranch is isolated in normal weather. In this weather, it's more so. If those men come here, they'll be counting on it. Then we make it less isolated, Mara said. Thane looked at her. The Basin Ranchers, she said. Harwell, the Deming family, the couple up at the North Pasture. I met them after the hearing. People who were at that room and saw what happened and made their own decisions about it. She looked at Thane steadily. You said you'd write to them. I did write to them. Then write again. Not an alarm, just a statement of what's happening, what you know, what you're doing about it. People who feel like they're informed tend to feel like they have a stake. People who feel they have a stake tend to show up. It wasn't a perfect plan. She knew it wasn't a perfect plan. It depended on neighbors having the will and the ability to make roads in serious winter, which was not guaranteed. It depended on the timing of Gideon's men being predictable enough to allow preparation, which was also not guaranteed. But it was better than waiting alone. Thane spent 2 hours writing letters that evening. Mara spent those same hours assembling what she'd been thinking about since the hearing. A clean copy of Doerr's dismissal ruling, Gideon's unpaid wage records in her journal, the 41 conversations she'd documented over 11 months, and a written account of the hearing testimony, including the names of everyone who had spoken, organized and legible, the kind of thing that would matter if someone later tried to rewrite what had happened. She did it at the kitchen table, by lamplight, while the snow outside continued its quiet erasure of the landscape. Thane came and looked over her shoulder once, briefly, and she could feel him reading what she'd written. He didn't say anything for a moment. You thought about this before Cecil came, he said. I thought about it since the night I walked out of the saloon, she said. I just didn't know what form it would take. He was quiet. Then, is there anything you need from me? She looked at what she'd written. Send the letters, she said. And don't let Orson do anything that makes his leg worse. Because if this comes to a confrontation in the yard, I need him to be able to stand up straight and look like he means it. She heard something in Thane's expression, not quite a laugh, a smaller version, the one that moved in just his eyes. I'll tell him you said that, he said. Don't, she said. He'll argue. Just make sure it happens. The letters went out the next morning with Eli, who was young enough and light enough to manage the roads better than anyone else, and who came back at midday with the news that Harwell had already been informed by a separate source, a rancher from the north end of the basin who had heard something from a freight driver and was, in Eli's words, not pleased and planning to do something about it, though I'm not sure what exactly. Which was enough for now. Enough to know they weren't alone. The break in the weather came on a Thursday, 5 days after Cecil's warning. Not a full break. The snow stopped and the sky cleared partially, the kind of partial clearing that gave a day's worth of passable road before the next system moved in. It was exactly the window Gideon's men would have been waiting for. Hollis's message came with the morning, a brief note delivered by a boy from town who'd been paid a coin to ride out. 3 words, they left at dawn. The yard was very quiet when Mara walked out of the cabin and found Thane standing at the fence, looking at the road. How long? She said. Hour and a half, maybe 2, depending on how hard they push in the conditions. He turned to look at her. He had that expression again, the quiet anger, the contained kind. You can still go to Harwell's place. He's 20 minutes west. I know, she said. He waited. I'm staying, she said. Same reason as before. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that had things in it she wasn't ready to name, and suspected he wasn't ready to name either. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when a decision had been made and there was nothing more useful to say about it, and turned back to the road. What happened over the next 2 hours was not dramatic in the way of the stories people would later tell about it. Preparation rarely is. Thane sent Eli on the back path to Harwell's with a final notification and instructions to stay there, which Eli objected to comprehensively and at length. and which Thane overruled with a brevity that closed the subject. Orson took a position inside the main house with Mara's documented records and the specific instructions to keep them dry and not do anything with his leg that Mara would have an opinion about. Mara herself went to the barn, not to hide. She was done with hiding. But because the hayloft gave a clear view of the approach road, and she wanted to know what she was dealing with before they reached the yard. She had been up there for perhaps 40 minutes when she saw them come through the tree line. 3 horses. 3 men. The one in front was large across the shoulders, with the particular posture of someone accustomed to being the most intimidating presence in any given situation and who had made a professional habit of it. The 2 behind him moved differently from each other. One cautious, one with the loose ease of someone who doesn't expect trouble, which was usually more dangerous than the ones who did. They rode into the yard without hurrying, and stopped, because the yard was not empty. Harwell was there. He'd come by the North Pasture Road with 2 of his own hands, arriving 20 minutes before Gideon's men without drama or announcement, simply present in the way that a large, weathered rancher with 30 years in the valley is present, taking up the space he occupies without apology or performance. The Deming brothers were there too, having ridden down from the ridge, standing near the water trough with the specific patience of men who have done physical work their whole lives and have learned that most situations resolve faster if you let them come to you. And Thane was standing in the center of the yard in front of the main house door, not armed in any visible way, not performing anything, just standing where he lived. The man in front, Cutter, presumably, looked at the assembled yard with an expression that moved through several rapid calculations. That was when Mara came down from the loft. She didn't run. She walked around the side of the barn and into the yard and stopped a few feet from Thane, close enough that the proximity was a statement without being theatrical about it. Cutter looked at her. His eyes were the flat professional eyes of a man who had learned to look at situations rather than people. "We're looking for a woman named Ellison," he said. His voice was ordinary, businesslike. "You found her," Mara said. He looked at the assembled yard again. The count had reached 7 people plus Mara and Thane, which was considerably more than 3 men on hired horses had been expecting. "We were told this was a private property matter," Cutter said. The edge in his voice was controlled, but it was there. "It is a private property matter," Mara said. "Mr. Rusk has no claim to this property, to the people on it, or to my time or presence. That was settled in a formal proceeding in Cinder Ridge 6 days ago." She looked at him steadily. "Did Mr. Rusk share that detail when he hired you?" Cutter's jaw shifted slightly. "Not much. Enough." "He told us there was an unresolved labor dispute," he said. "The dispute was resolved," Mara said. "In my favor. I have the written ruling in that house, signed by Silas Dorr, who I believe Mr. Rusk introduced to the valley himself." She paused just long enough to let that register. "You've been hired to enforce something that no longer exists. And the people standing in this yard witnessed the proceeding that ended it," Harwell said, from where he was standing, without raising his voice. "I was there." "One of the Deming brothers. So was I." Cutter looked at the man to his right. Something passed between them that wasn't words. The second man looked at the assembled yard for a long moment. He looked at Thane, who had said nothing and moved nothing throughout this entire exchange, which Mara had come to understand was its own form of communication. The particular authority of a man who does not need to raise his voice because he has already decided what he's going to do if it comes to that, and everyone can see that he's decided. Then the second man said "Cutter," in a tone that meant something. The first snow of the next system was beginning. Just a few flakes, intermittent, the kind that precede the real thing by an hour or so. They fell through the yard's cold air and disappeared against the dark ground. Cutter was very still on his horse for a long moment. "We weren't told about a ruling," he said finally. His voice had dropped the edge. It was flatter now, more careful. "I know you weren't," Mara said. "Mr. Rusk has a habit of sharing the parts of a story that are useful to him and leaving out the parts that aren't." She kept her voice even, not unkind, not victorious, factual. "Whatever he promised you for this job, you'd be completing it on false pretenses. And the people standing in this yard have names and memories, and so do I." The third man at the back hadn't spoken once. He was looking at the main house, at Orson visible in the window, at the Deming brothers near the trough, at Mara. The calculation in his face was plain, This was not what they'd been sent into. Cutter pulled his horse back a half step. "We'll need to speak with Rusk," he said. "That's between you and him," Mara said. And then a voice came from the tree line at the edge of the yard, the place where the road came through. And it was a voice she recognized immediately, because she had spent 11 months learning every register of it, every quality and inflection of how it changed when things weren't going the way Gideon wanted them to go. He had been there the whole time. He came out of the trees on foot, which meant he'd left his horse somewhere on the road and come in quietly, intending to watch. He looked different from the Red Lantern Knight, less controlled, his coat open despite the cold, his face carrying the specific disarrangement of a man who had been waiting and watching and has just seen the thing he was waiting for not happen. "Don't you walk away from this," he said. He was talking to Cutter, but his eyes were on Mara. Cutter looked at him. The look had something in it, the cold assessment of a man recalculating a business arrangement. "You didn't tell us about a ruling," he said. "The ruling is wrong," Gideon said. His voice had the strained quality of someone holding something back with both hands. "Dorr didn't have all the—" "Doesn't matter," Cutter said. "We don't work disputed rulings. Too complicated." "I'm paying you what—" "You're paying us to collect on a valid claim," the second man said. He had a measured voice. "This doesn't look like a valid claim, Mr. Rusk." Gideon's face was doing something she had never quite seen it do in 11 months. She had seen his calculation, and his charm, and his careful anger, and his cold patience. She had not seen him look at a situation and not know what to do next. He looked at Mara, really looked at her, without the intermediary of the room or the document or the planned performance. "You did this," he said. It wasn't an accusation exactly. It was more like a statement of disbelief, like he was still working out how it had happened. "Yes," she said. There was no triumph in it. She had thought there might be. She had imagined this moment in various forms since the night at the Red Lantern, and had imagined feeling something larger when it came. What she actually felt was a kind of tired clarity. He had bet everything on her being afraid. He had miscalculated that from the beginning, and all of this, all of it, from the contract in the poker pot to Dorr to these 3 men on hired horses, had been the elaborating consequences of that one original miscalculation. Gideon looked at the yard, at Harwell, at the Deming brothers, at Thane, at Orson, still visible in the window, at Eli, who had apparently not stayed at Harwell's after all, and was standing somewhere behind Mara with the particular focused expression he got when he was trying to hold himself completely still. He looked at 3 men on horses who were not going to finish the job he'd hired them for. He stood very still. "Nobody's going to back you, Gideon," Harwell said. Not harshly. Plainly, the way you state something that everyone in the yard already knows and you're simply making audible. "Not today. Not on this." Gideon's hands were at his sides. She could see them from where she stood, the slow curling and releasing of his fingers, the physical version of something happening in him that had no better outlet. He looked at Mara one more time. She met his eyes. She didn't look away. She had made a decision, somewhere in the past weeks, that she was not going to arrange her behavior around Gideon Rusk's ability to be made uncomfortable. He had taken 11 months of her life and tried to take more after that. The least she could do for herself was to look at him directly when it ended. He looked away first. He turned and walked back toward the tree line. Nobody stopped him. Nobody spoke. The yard watched him go in the specific silence of a group of people who are all choosing not to do the easier thing, which would have been to say something because they understood that silence was its own form of conclusion. Cutter looked at Mara. "We'll be going," he said. "Good morning to you," she said. They turned their horses and rode back down the ranch road, following Gideon's tracks through the snow without apparently intending to and without any comment on the irony of it. The new snow was coming in earnest now. The flakes had thickened, the wind picking up. The second system arriving on the schedule the sky had been promising all morning. The yard stood in it for a moment. All of them, the assembled improbable collection of people that a woman nobody had believed in had managed to call to a cold yard on a winter Thursday. And the snow came down on all of them equally and covered Gideon's footprints and the tracks of 3 hired horses and the marks of what had happened here. And in an hour, there would be no visible evidence that any of it had taken place. But the people in the yard knew. They would carry it the way you carry things that actually happen. Not as a story you tell, but as a thing that became part of how you understand what's possible. Orson came out of the house, ignoring what Mara had specifically asked him to do about his leg, and stood on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets and surveyed the yard with an expression of deep satisfaction that he didn't bother to conceal. "Well," he said. It was, Mara decided, a perfectly sufficient thing to say. Harwell shook Thane's hand and nodded to Mara, one of those nods that carries the weight of considerably more than a nod, and accepted the offer of coffee before the road back. The Deming brothers came inside for the same reason, and for a while the kitchen held more people than it was built for, and the noise of it was the specific warmth of something that has just held together and is still processing the fact. Thane stood near Mara while this kitchen filled with other voices around them, not touching, not performing anything. "You were right," he said quietly. "About which part?" "Most of it." He paused. "He came himself." "I know." She turned it over during the confrontation and after. He couldn't help it. He needed to see it, needed to believe he could change it if he was there in person. She looked at her hands. That's always been his real problem. He can plan. He can adapt. Thane looked at her for a moment. "You've been thinking about him for a long time." 11 months, she said, and then some. He was quiet. Then, "Is it over, do you think?" She considered this honestly. "I think it's over the way things like this are over," she said. "Which means it happened, it changed things, and he's still out there somewhere being who he is." She looked at the kitchen full of people who had come when she'd needed them. "But I think the part that was about me, about making me small or scared or gone, I think that part's done." She believed it when she said it. She was also aware that belief and certainty were different things, and she had long since made her peace with not always knowing the difference until later. What she knew for certain was this. She was standing in a warm kitchen surrounded by people who had shown up, and outside the snow was erasing the morning's trouble from the ground. And tomorrow there would be more to do, and she would do it. That was enough. That had always been enough. Gideon Rusk left Cinder Ridge on a Friday, 11 days after the standoff in the Mercer ranch yard. He didn't announce it. He didn't hold a farewell. He settled what debts he absolutely had to, the ones with men large enough or connected enough that leaving them unpaid would have followed him. And he left the rest, which was considerable, and he loaded what he could fit into a single wagon and drove out on the freight road before most of the town was awake. Hollis saw him go. Hollis saw most things that happened in Cinder Ridge before dawn, because Hollis had the particular insomnia of a man who had witnessed too many things over too many years and had never quite found a way to stop processing them in the dark. He told Harwell, who told 2 other ranchers, and by mid-morning the news had moved through the valley in the quiet, efficient way that news moves through small places where everyone's business is everyone else's weather. It reached Mercer Ranch by noon, again through Cecil, who had become something of an informal dispatch rider between town and the basin over the past weeks without anyone officially asking him to take on the role. Mara was in the root cellar when Cecil arrived, doing the midwinter inventory she'd been putting off. A precise accounting of what remained and what the remaining weeks of winter would require, which was the kind of arithmetic she found both tedious and necessary, the same way she found most of the unglamorous work of surviving tedious and necessary. She heard voices in the yard and came up to find Cecil with the news already half delivered to Thane, Orson standing on the porch with his coffee, and Eli somewhere up on the barn roof doing a repair that Mara had been asking about for a week. She stood in the cellar doorway and listened. When Cecil finished, the yard was quiet for a moment. "Where's he going?" Thane asked. "North, Hollis thinks, toward the freight crossroads at Dunbar. After that—" Cecil shrugged. "Hard to say." Mara thought about this. She thought about Gideon on the freight road before dawn, loading a single wagon, leaving without announcement. She tried to find something in herself that felt like satisfaction, and found instead something more complicated and less comfortable. Not grief, not sympathy, but a kind of flat recognition. He had built something in this valley over years. Not something good, but something real. A network of debts and dependencies and careful relationships that had taken time and effort, and he had broken it with his own hands by being exactly who he was when the situation finally asked him to be otherwise. There was a lesson in that. She wasn't sure it was a lesson Gideon would ever draw from it, which was the thing that made it sad rather than just instructive. "Let him go," she said. Not bitterly, just as a statement of her own intention. "What he does in Dunbar, or wherever he lands next, that's not ours to track." Orson made a sound of agreement. Thane looked at her for a moment with the expression she had learned over these months to read more accurately. Not fully, she didn't think she'd ever rid Thane Mercer fully, but accurately enough to know that what she was seeing was something close to relief. Not for himself, for her. She went back to the root cellar. The inventory took another hour and told her what she'd expected it to tell her. They would make it to spring with careful management and without much comfort to spare, but they would make it. That was the summary of the whole winter at Mercer Ranch, she thought. Not comfort, but endurance. Not ease, but adequacy. The things that were broken had been repaired well enough. The things that were thin had been rationed. The people who were hurting had been treated with what was available. It wasn't the life anyone would have designed from scratch, but it was the life that had been built from the materials at hand, and she had come to believe over these cold months that this was actually the only honest kind of life, the kind assembled from what's real rather than what's imagined. She brought the inventory upstairs and sat down at the kitchen table and wrote out the numbers in the margin of the journal she'd been keeping since she arrived. The same journal that had the 41 conversations documented. The same journal that had gone into Door's hearing room as evidence and come out again, worn at the corners and slightly water-damaged from being carried through snow, but intact. She looked at the first page. Her own handwriting, from 11 months of working for Gideon, careful and small because she'd been rationing paper along with everything else. She turned to a new page and started writing the inventory in the same careful hand. It occurred to her, writing it, that this was the first document she'd kept since arriving at Mercer Ranch that wasn't in some way a defense. Everything before had been preparation for the next thing Gideon might try. This was just numbers, just the winter's accounting, just the ordinary paperwork of a life that was beginning, slowly and incompletely, to be hers. The thaw began in March, as it always did, grudgingly and in stages. A few days of warmth that retreated, then more warmth, then a cold snap that felt like the season reconsidering, and then finally the slow, irreversible softening that meant winter was done, making decisions, and spring was taking over. The garden was the first real proof of it. Mara had been out there before the ground was fully workable, pressing her hands into the soil the same way she'd pressed them in the autumn, reading the frost line. She started the early seeds in trays on the south windowsill of the cabin in February. Small, determined things that had no business existing yet, but did anyway, which she found privately encouraging. By March, they were real enough to transplant, and she did it on a cold but clear afternoon with Eli working the second bed while she worked the first, both of them in the specific silence of people doing careful work that requires attention. "Does it feel different?" Eli said. He was talking about the work. She'd learned his conversational shorthand well enough by now to know when a question needed context and when it didn't. "Then what?" she said. "Then last autumn when you started it. Does it feel different now?" She pushed a seedling into the soil and pressed the earth around it. "Yes," she said. "How?" She thought about how to say it honestly, rather than poetically, because honest was what Eli needed from her, and poetry was what the situation didn't. "Last autumn, I was doing it to prove something," she said, "or to make myself useful enough that I couldn't be pushed out, or both." She moved to the next hole. "Now I'm doing it because the plants need to go in, and I know how, and I want to." Eli considered this. "That's different?" "The result looks the same," she said, "but the inside of it is different, and the inside of things matters more than people usually admit." He thought about this for a while, in the way he thought about things. Slowly, thoroughly, the way you have to think when you're young enough that the ideas are still finding their places in you and don't yet have established shelves to sit on. "Orson says you're staying," he said. She hadn't announced anything formally. She wasn't sure there had been anything to announce. The decision had happened the way some of the most real decisions happen, not as a moment, but as a gradual settling. "Orson talks a great deal for a man who claimed to be private," she said. "He's proud of you," Eli said. "He doesn't say that to you because he's Orson, but he says it around you, constantly. It's almost embarrassing." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm staying," she said. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and it sounded, in the cold spring air over the garden bed, exactly as true as she'd known it to be for some time. Not because she owed anyone anything, not because she had nowhere else to go. She had spent the winter rebuilding enough standing in the valley that options existed now that hadn't before. But because this particular place, with its imperfect people and its perpetually insufficient firewood and its old foreman who refused to properly rest his leg, had become the place she wanted to be. Which was, she'd learned, the only reason worth having for being anywhere. The settlement of Gideon's assets took until April, handled by a valley magistrate who came through on his quarterly circuit. The unpaid wages, hers and apparently others, because it turned out Gideon's habit of not paying people was more extensive than even she had known, were assessed against his remaining property and the proceeds of the supply operation sale, which a buyer from outside the valley had purchased at a price that reflected the circumstances of the sale. The resulting settlement was divided among several claimants, and what came to Mara was not a large sum, but it was real and documented, and entirely hers. She sat with it for a while before deciding what to do with it. What she'd been thinking about since the winter had a shape now that spring had given her back the land to work with. The Mercer Ranch's east boundary had a flat piece of ground between the main property and the creek, sheltered from the north wind by a natural rise in the terrain, with good soil and reliable water access, and enough distance from the main house to be its own thing without being disconnected. She'd been looking at it since November, and she'd been thinking about it since January, and she'd been planning it in the margins of the journal since February. She brought it to Thane on an evening in late April, when the light lasted long enough to make the whole valley visible from the fence line. The kind of evening that reminds you why people chose to build their lives in places like this, despite everything those places cost. She showed him the rough drawings she'd made, the kitchen space and the herb storage, and the 2 small rooms that could serve as shelter for people who needed a night or a week to get their feet under them. The garden beds she'd planned to double, producing enough to share rather than just enough to sustain. The list of plants she intended to grow that had medical applications she knew how to use. Thane looked at the drawings for a long time. "Blackstone House," she said. "That's what I want to call it, after the basin." He looked at her. "It's your land," she said. "I'm not pretending otherwise. I'm asking if you'll let me build on the corner of it. If the answer is no, I'll find a different parcel. Harwell said there's a piece near the north pasture that—" "Mara," he said. She stopped. "You don't have to negotiate with me for space on this land," he said. He said it quietly, in the particular way he said things that mattered. Without decoration, without softening, just plainly. "You've been running this ranch's kitchen since October. You saved Orson's leg. You probably saved the whole operation from a bad winter." He paused. "You can build whatever you want to build on whatever corner of this land makes sense for it." She looked at the drawings. "I'm not doing it for the ranch," she said. "I want that to be clear. I'm doing it because there are people in this valley who have what Orson had. Something going wrong that they're hiding because they're afraid of the cost of asking for help. And I know how to help some of those things, and not helping when you can is its own kind of waste." "I know why you're doing it," he said. She looked at him. "I've known you for 6 months," he said. "I know why you do things." The evening light was doing what it did this time of year, going gold at the edges, making ordinary things look significant. She was suspicious of light like that, on principle, because she'd learned that the feeling things look significant was not the same as them being significant. But she also thought that sometimes the light was simply accurate, that sometimes things were what they looked like. "Thane," she said. "Yeah. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what's been building between us," she said, "because I've been pretending for 3 months and I'm tired of it." He was very still. "I'm also not going to make it into something it's not yet," she said, "because that's the other way people ruin things that are actually good. They rush them into a shape before they're ready." He looked at her for a long moment. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I know," she said. "And I think you know. And I'd like us to both know it out loud and then build Blackstone House and see what the next season looks like." Something shifted in his expression, the careful containment of him giving way, just slightly, to something that had clearly been sitting behind it for quite some time. He wasn't a man who showed things easily, and she had stopped needing him to be. What she could see was enough. "That's a reasonable approach," he said. "I'm a reasonable person," she said. "You really aren't," he said. "You're one of the most unreasonable people I've ever encountered, in the best possible sense of that." She laughed. A real laugh. The the kind that surprised her a little, which was the only kind worth having. She turned back to the valley and let the last of the evening go the way it was going, and he stood beside her, and neither of them reached for more than what was there. It was enough. Construction on Blackstone House began in May, with Eli doing more than anyone asked of him, and Orson directing from a chair he'd been made to sit in, which he complained about constantly, and which everyone ignored with the practiced ease of people who had learned that ignoring Orson's complaints was the fastest way through them. Harwell sent 2 of his hands for a week. The Deming brothers came on 2 separate Saturdays with tools and the uncomplicated helpfulness of men who don't need a reason beyond being asked. It wasn't quick and it wasn't clean, and at one point the east wall went up crooked enough that it had to be partially taken down and redone, which cost a week and a half and produced a quality of silence from Mara that everyone recognized as the silence of a woman exercising enormous restraint. But by the end of June it stood. Not large, but solid. Not grand, but real. A kitchen with a working stove, a storage room for the dried herbs she'd been accumulating since autumn, and 2 small rooms with beds that had been donated by 3 different families in the valley who had cleaned out storage and decided these were better used than kept. The herb garden went in on the east side where it got good morning light, and the expanded vegetable garden ran the full length of the south-facing wall, and the whole thing sat in the afternoon shadow of the rise that protected it from the north wind, exactly where she'd planned it in the journal margins in February. The first people to use it weren't stranded travelers. They were a family from the far end of the basin, a woman with 3 children whose husband had broken his leg in a fence accident and couldn't work, who had been quietly running out of options in the way that frontier families run out of options, slowly and without drama until there's nothing left. They stayed for 2 weeks. Mara treated the husband's leg while it continued mending, fed the family from the expanded stores, and spent several evenings showing the oldest child, a girl of about 12 who had her own Eli-like hunger for practical knowledge, which plants did what and why. When they left, the woman took Mara's hands in both of hers and said, "I didn't know places like this existed." Mara thought about what to say to that. "They don't exist," she said finally, "until someone builds them." The woman looked at her for a moment and then laughed, a slightly wet laugh, the kind that comes when emotion and relief arrive at the same time. And then they loaded the wagon and went back to their end of the basin. Lenora Vane came in September. She didn't announce herself. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in a wagon driven by her husband Lawrence, who had the expression of a man who was there under specific instructions and was determined to see them through without making them worse. She climbed down from the wagon with a basket covered in cloth and walked to the door of Blackstone House, where Mara happened to be standing because she'd heard the wagon on the road. They looked at each other. "My granddaughter," Lenora said. She pulled back a corner of the basket cloth, which turned out not to be a basket at all, but a carry wrap with a child inside it, perhaps 18 months, with a flushed face and the particular stillness of a sick child that was different from the stillness of a sleeping one. "She's been feverish for 4 days. The doctor's 2 towns over, and the road—" "Come in," Mara said. She said it without hesitation, without making Lenora earn it or acknowledge anything or account for the months of whispered suspicion and the withdrawn support that had made the hearing harder than it needed to be. She said it because the child was sick, and Lenora was frightened, and those 2 facts were what the moment contained, and everything else was a different moment. Lenora came in. The child had a chest infection. Not dangerous yet, but heading there if it was left alone. Mara had the things she needed, the preparations she'd been making and storing since the autumn, the knowledge of what worked for small bodies and what didn't, the patience to explain to a frightened grandmother what she was doing and why at each step, which mattered because frightened people needed to understand what was happening to the people they loved. Lenora sat in the chair beside the small bed and held her granddaughter's hand and watched. After an hour, when the child's breathing had eased and her temperature had begun to drop, and she had fallen into a real sleep. Rather than the restless half-consciousness of illness, Lenora sat back in the chair and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for days. "She's going to be all right," Mara said. It wasn't a reassurance. It was an assessment, stated plainly. Lenora looked at her hands in her lap. She was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an apology," she said. She said it the way that proud people say difficult things, looking straight ahead at the middle distance rather than at the person they're saying it to. For what I said. For what I repeated. For the support I pulled from you before the hearing when you needed. You came, Mara said. To the hearing, you sat in the room. I didn't speak, Lenora said. No, Mara agreed. But you didn't leave either. And at a certain point you stopped looking at me like a problem and started looking at Gideon the same way. She paused. That mattered. Even if you didn't say anything, the room could see where you'd landed. Lenora looked at her for the first time since they'd come in. You're more generous than I would be, she said, in your position. I'm not generous, Mara said. I'm practical. Carrying what you did to me would be another weight I'd have to carry, and I've put down enough weight this year. Lenora was quiet for a moment. Then, what is this place going to be? Long term. Mara looked at the room, the child sleeping, the herbs drying on the rack near the window, the shelves of preparation she'd been building all summer, the winter beds visible through the window beginning their autumn preparation. A place where people can come when they have nowhere else to go and something's gone wrong, she said. That's all. That's the whole plan. That's not a small thing. No, Mara agreed. It's not. Lenora stayed until the child woke, alert and asking for water, which was the best possible sign. Lawrence came in from wherever he'd been being useful outside and sat beside his wife, and held the child with the unguarded tenderness of a grandfather who had been frightened and was now not. Mara made something warm for all of them and sat at the table while they sat together, and it was an ordinary enough scene that it would have seemed unremarkable to anyone who didn't know the full distance that had been traveled to arrive at it. When they left, Lenora paused at the door. I'll tell people, she said, about this place. What it is. I'd appreciate that, Mara said. She stood in the doorway of Blackstone House and watched the wagon make its way back down the road toward Cinder Ridge, and she thought about how many turns a thing has to take before it arrives somewhere unexpected, and how the unexpected somewhere is often more right than anything you could have planned. The harvest came in October, and it was better than anyone had expected. Not miraculous. The Blackstone Basin didn't deal in miracles, it dealt in weather and labor and the occasional good season, but solid. The garden produced what she'd calculated it would produce and a little beyond, which she took as a sign not of good fortune but of adequate planning, which was the kind of sign she trusted. The livestock were in better condition than the previous autumn. Orson's leg had held through the summer's work and was managing the early cold with the minimal complaint of something that had been properly treated and given time to actually heal. Eli had been spending increasing time at Blackstone House, not as a patient and not exactly as labor, but in the way of someone who has found a thing that makes sense to them and keeps returning to it. He could identify 40 varieties of medicinal plant now. He knew which preparations worked on what conditions and at what doses. He knew how to assess a sick animal versus a sick person and what the overlapping treatments were. He was 16 and already knew more practical medicine than most adults in the valley, and what Mara found most significant about this was not the knowledge itself, but the way he held it. Not as a skill to be deployed, but as a responsibility to be carried. She'd told him that once. He'd taken it seriously in exactly the way she'd hoped. Are you going to teach me everything you know? He asked one afternoon, sitting at the workbench in the Blackstone House kitchen. No, she said. He looked at her. Because I'm still learning, she said. We'll learn the next parts together. He thought about this. That's a strange way to teach someone. That's the only honest way, she said. Anyone who tells you they know everything is someone you should stop listening to immediately. He filed this away with all the other things she'd given him that he'd stored for later use, which was, she thought, exactly what knowledge was supposed to be. Not something you received complete, but something you built over time, adding to it as you went, revising the parts that turned out to be wrong. She asked Thane to marry her on an evening in late October, standing at the edge of the garden as the last of the harvest came in. She asked him because she had decided, over the course of the year, that the things you want are worth saying out loud rather than waiting for circumstances to say them for you. She had learned that lesson the hard way, in 11 months of not saying what she needed clearly enough, in a year of watching what happened when you stepped into a room and said the true thing plainly, and she saw no reason not to apply it here. Thane looked at her. He looked at the garden, at Blackstone House on the other side of the East Rise, at the main house where the kitchen window was lit, and she could hear Orson and Eli arguing about something inside with the particular ease of people who argue because they enjoy it and not because they're actually in disagreement. "I was going to ask you," he said. "I know," she said. "I didn't want to wait." Something moved across his face, the thing she'd been seeing there for months, now fully visible, not performing anything. "You never wait for anything," he said, not as a criticism. "I waited 11 months for Gideon to pay wages that never came," she said. "I decided I was done waiting for things I actually wanted." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. Just that. Not an elaboration, not a speech. Just the plainest possible answer to the plainest possible question, which was exactly what she would have expected from him, and which was, she thought, exactly right. They married in November, under the cottonwood trees at the edge of the property, on a cold, clear afternoon when the valley was its most itself, stripped of everything unnecessary, every shape clear and specific, the light low and honest. Harwell was there. The Deming brothers, Cecil. The family from the far end of the basin whose husband's leg had healed. Lenora and Lawrence. A dozen other people who had become the particular shape of a community that forms not from proximity, but from shared experience. Orson stood up straight for the whole thing, which cost him the following 2 days in a chair. And he did not complain about this at all, which was how Mara knew how much it meant to him. Eli stood at the edge of the group with the expression of a boy who is trying to look like he's not feeling things very hard and is not succeeding. And Mara caught his eye once during the proceedings and gave him the kind of look that doesn't need words. And he straightened slightly and looked back at the cottonwoods with something more composed. What was said was simple and unmemorable in the way that real things said between real people often are. Not beautiful language, but true language, which is its own kind of beauty if you're paying the right kind of attention. Afterward, standing in the cold with her husband and the people who had made the year what it was, Mara looked at Blackstone House and the garden and the ranch that had been barely holding together when she arrived, and thought about what any of it meant. She didn't arrive at a clean conclusion. That wasn't how meaning worked in her experience. It didn't arrive complete and fully formed. It accumulated, the way everything real accumulated, slowly, imperfectly, in the gaps between doing the next thing and the thing after that. What she knew was this. A year ago, a man had put her name on a poker table because he'd decided she was worth nothing. He had made that decision with the confidence of someone who expected the world to agree with him. And for a long time, the world had agreed with him, or at least had not disagreed with him loudly enough to matter. But worth wasn't assigned. That was the thing Gideon had never understood and would probably never understand wherever he'd landed in the North, with his single wagon and his grudges and his talent for making himself necessary to people who weren't watching carefully enough. Worth wasn't what someone decided about you in a room where you had no voice. It wasn't the sum of what you owned or who you knew or whether anyone with power had decided to speak on your behalf. It was what you built, what you chose to build when the building was finally yours to do. She had built a garden that would feed people through winters. She had built a house where the sick could come and not be turned away. She had built a record, 41 conversations in a worn journal, that had stood up in a room full of people and told the truth about what had actually happened. She had built a friendship with an old man who'd never wanted one. She had built something with a boy who was going to spend his life helping people in ways she would never fully know. She had built, carefully and without rushing, something real with a quiet man who had once torn a piece of paper in half and offered her the only thing she'd actually needed, a choice. None of it had been clean. None of it had been easy. None of it looked the way she might have imagined it if someone had asked her, on the floor of the saloon with the serving tray in her shaking hands, what a good life might look like. It looked instead like what it was, specific and imperfect and entirely hers. The years afterward built on what that year had laid down, and not always smoothly. The basin had its hard winters and its lost livestock and its quarrels and its sorrows, and Blackstone House had its failures alongside its successes. The cases where Mara's knowledge wasn't enough, the times when people arrived too late, the ongoing tension between what she could offer and what people actually needed. There were seasons when the garden flooded and seasons when it dried, and both types required starting over rather than grieving. Thane remained a man of few words and deep reliability, which meant he was still occasionally maddening and always present, and Mara had long since decided these were acceptable terms. Orson's leg gave him trouble every winter without fail, and he complained about it in direct proportion to how much it was bothering him, which meant the ranch's barometric pressure could be read by the volume of Orson Pike's daily monologue. Eli left for 2 years to study properly with a physician in the eastern settlements and came back knowing more than Mara had taught him in both directions. Things she'd been doing wrong and things she hadn't known to do at all. And the pleasure of that particular exchange was one of the things she treasured most, because there is something genuinely satisfying about being corrected by someone you helped become good enough to correct you. People remembered Mara in different ways depending on when they'd come to know her. The ones who'd been in the Red Lantern the night Gideon put the contract on the table remembered her stillness, the way she'd stood with the tray in her hands and not flinched. The ones who'd been in the Cinder Ridge meeting hall remembered the 41 months. The ones who came to Blackstone House remembered whatever she'd done for them specifically, and that was what she would have wanted if she'd been asked what she wanted people to remember. Not the story of what was done to her, the story of what she'd done after. The valley changed, as valleys do, and some of the changes were good, and some weren't, and through all of them, the flat piece of ground between the creek and the rise had its kitchen and its garden and its dried herbs and its 2 small rooms where the light came in early in the morning and the north wind couldn't reach. And if you came to the Blackstone Basin in those years and found yourself without options and with something gone wrong, and if someone sent you to Blackstone House the way people eventually started doing as naturally as pointing toward water when someone was thirsty, you would find a woman there who would not ask you what you deserved or whether you'd earned the right to be helped. She would look at what was wrong and tell you what she knew and do what she could. And she would not tell you it was nothing, because she had spent enough years being told she was nothing to know what that particular lie cost the person it was told to, and she had made herself a promise, in a cold cabin on the first night she'd ever had a choice freely given, that she would not pass that cost on. That was the whole of it. That was all. And that, in the end,